So, for the last 40 plus years, video games have released in what we now call generations, which was a nice, clean, organized way to look at the advancement of technology and the consoles available at any given time. This, of course, isn't new to any of us. We're all familiar with the 8-bit generation, the 16-bit generation, 32 and 64-bit generation. Then we kind of started numbering them 5th gen, 6th gen, 7th gen, all the way up until today, where we kind of try to refer to the current consoles and the current generation as the 9th generation. But in my opinion, I don't really think that numbered generations have any value or definition anymore. As somebody who's been gaming since the early 80s, I am very happy to say that I saw and lived through all of these console generations and the transitions from one to the other. I mean, I've said it before in previous videos, my first console was the Atari 2600 before the NES and Sega Master System released. But obviously, the advent of the NES and that 8-bit era changed everything and laid the foundation for the entire gaming industry and the hobby that we love today, here at the end of 2024 going into 2025. It really goes as far back as the NES, quote-unquote, saving gaming back in the mid-80s. I mentioned recently as well that the 16-bit generation, which was mostly dominated by the Super Nintendo versus the Sega Genesis, is my favorite generation of all time. That being said, my favorite console of all time is the Nintendo 64, which falls in that kind of 5th generation, sort of 32, 64-bit era, which is a little bit strange compared to other generations, but by and large still encompasses Nintendo, Sega, and Sony all on the market releasing their consoles at about the exact same time. And so really the thesis statement and the point of this video and this conversation is to discuss how for 40 plus years we've been seeing any respective console manufacturer that's been on the market at the time, whether it's been Nintendo, Atari, Sega, Sony, Microsoft, or some of the other weird spin-off consoles and companies that existed in the mid-90s, we've traditionally seen the main players that define generations release their console at around the same time, usually within a year or two of each other. And then, of course, that generation will end and they will all release their successor console also at around the same time, within a year or two of each other. But nowadays, the current generation we have on the market, which is comprised of the PlayStation 5, the Nintendo Switch, and the Xbox Series consoles, in my opinion, things have changed a little bit. And I know that we refer to the prior generation as the 8th generation, right? So we applied that numbered generation to it. The 6th gen being PS2, GameCube, Xbox. The 7th gen being Wii, PS3, and 360. The 8th gen being a little bit strange in the sense that it technically was comprised of the PS4, the Xbox One, and the Nintendo Wii U, my beloved and unfairly treated Wii U, but the Nintendo Switch definitely muddies things. So I feel like the Wii U and the Switch combined have kind of changed in a lot of ways how we look at and define and label generations. Now, it should be noted before I jump more into my theory and really my opinion about all of this that I'm not even saying that this is a bad thing. I know that there are some folks out there who have very strong, passionate feelings about how we should look at and label and define generations nowadays, particularly when it comes to Nintendo, because they are the odd ones out that I think have kind of shaken up this whole concept, which is why I wanted to talk about it today. But nothing being said here is like a negative, right? So Nintendo's my favorite company. For a lot of you guys and people who watch me, it's probably yours as well. So don't mistake how I'm going to discuss Nintendo breaking this concept as a negative thing or even an insult lobbied towards the company. There are things to criticize Nintendo for, obviously, and I've done it in the past and I'll do it again when called upon to do so. But this concept is not a bad thing. It's just something I've observed and I realized over the years that I think it's changed the way we refer to generations, the current generation we're in. And with the Switch 2 coming soon, I mean, we all think we're like days, weeks, or months away from seeing the thing, and who knows when we're going to play it sometime soon. I think it's important to talk about this now because of how some people might want to label the Switch 2 as potentially a 10th generation console. So my opinion and theory on this concept really comes down to one simple fact, and that is, to me, the 8th generation is the last time we could apply a true title and a number to a generation. And the reason for this is simple, and I've already referred to it in the video already, and it has to do with Nintendo and their transition from the Wii U to the Switch in the middle of the lives of the other two consoles on the market at the time, being the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One. The 8th generation started like normal. Nintendo released the Wii U in November of 2012, and only a year later, in November of 2013, the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One came out. That is right in line and completely on par with how all generations tend to release, going back several decades. I mean, when you look at the 16-bit generation, people sometimes forget this, but the Genesis and the Super Nintendo were released 2 years apart. The Genesis was released in 1989, and the Super Nintendo was released in 1991. And hell, the 6th generation kind of had the same thing going, where you had the Dreamcast start that generation in 99, a year later was the PS2 in 2000, and then a year after that was the GameCube and Xbox in 2001. So that whole generation started across a 2-year span. So we go back to the 8th generation, that 1-year span between the Wii U and then the PS4 and Xbox One, that was the beginning of the 8th generation. However, the Wii U, as much as I love and defend it, my last video I even spent a bunch of time talking about this exact topic, it didn't sell very well. It wasn't successful, which breaks my heart, but it is the truth. And so Nintendo found themselves in a crazy position that turned out to be the best business move they could have ever made. They moved on from the Wii U after only, 4, almost 5 years. Because in early 2017, 4.5 years into the life of the Wii U, they released their next console, the Nintendo Switch, which, of course, coexisted alongside of the other two 8th generation consoles, PS4 and Xbox One, for another 3 years. And so it all comes down to Nintendo and their transition from the Wii U to the Switch. The Switch released in effectively the middle-ish of the general 8th generation life cycle, right? Which went from 2012/2013 to around 2020 when the PS5 and the Xbox Series X came out, right? So 2 of the 3 console manufacturers, right? So 2/3 of the entire generation based on hardware, right? Continued beyond the release of the Switch. So things get tricky when you look at the Nintendo Switch and trying to call it a 9th generation console. In a way, you could say Nintendo beat Sony and Microsoft to the punch by starting the 9th generation 3 years before they joined the 9th generation with the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X. This gets very complicated to talk about, I feel, so hopefully it doesn't get too convoluted listening to me describe it. But that's one way to look at it. And technically, if you just look at like the path of numbers in order, that's true, right? Because if the Wii U was Nintendo's 8th generation console, the Switch, by definition of numbers, becomes their 9th generation console. However, I feel like it becomes not accurate. It's not a problem to call the Switch the 9th generation console, but I think it becomes not accurate to call it the 9th generation console because, again, they're only 1/3 of the whole console market moving on to a new piece of hardware and a new piece of technology. And that technology itself didn't even really leapfrog necessarily the PS4 and Xbox One. It kind of became, I mean, maybe it's more powerful, but it's a little bit more on par with those consoles. I don't know the technology stuff very well, so to be fair, I shouldn't really talk about it because I might be wrong about this. But most of us know games a lot of times would look better on the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One than even the Switch, even though the Switch is impressive technology for what it is. So I believe that Nintendo released like a mid-generation new console with the Switch, but the next generation, what some people would call the 9th generation, didn't really start until the other 2/3 of the industry, Sony and Microsoft, moved on to their consoles in 2020 with the PS5 and the Xbox Series X, and then you've got the PS5, Series X, and now the Switch continuing on that new/current generation that we're in today. Boy, oh boy, I gotta tell you guys, when you try to put words to these whole concepts and try to describe it in a way that feels like it makes sense, It's very tricky because I feel like I'm just talking gobbledygook. I know you guys all know gaming just like I do, so I know you're very much able to keep up with it, but I'm telling you, it just feels crazy to try to describe all this 9th gen, current gen, last gen, 8th gen, mid gen, Switch, PS4, Xbox One, Xbox Series X, blah, 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 blah. It's just, my brain feels like it's turning to putty trying to explain it in a way that hopefully makes sense for you guys to listen to. And so, either way, moving on, this is all a very, very long, convoluted way to say, because of everything I just described, the Switch kind of breaking the generational mold based on when it released, I don't think that it's really accurate to call the current generation the 9th generation anymore, even though, like I said, it's not technically wrong from a numbers standpoint. I feel like nowadays we no longer really have a label or a name or a numbered application to generations. I feel 9th generation is out the window, and I think that when the Switch 2 comes out several years before Sony and Microsoft again move on to their next generation, I don't think the Switch 2 is going to be the 10th generation, the start of some sort of weird 10th generation. Again, the number tracks, if you track 8th to 9th to 10th generation Nintendo console, maybe within Nintendo's business model of consoles, you could apply numbers specific to them. But I just feel like when you look at the hobby, the industry, and the technology as a whole, I think we're beyond labeling and defining generations because the consoles are no longer releasing alongside of each other. And to me, that matters. I think that is where you can define a generation and maybe try to give it some sort of specific name or a number, the way it had been for 40 years prior. Nowadays, with consoles and the 3 players on the market not really keeping in step with each other, this isn't a bad thing. Again, I'm not even saying this is negative, just a matter-of-fact conversation. With them no longer doing that because Nintendo is kind of releasing at their own cadence, I just don't think we need to refer to things as 9th gen, 10th gen going forward. I think we're now in the era of only referring to things as the current generation of whatever's on the market at the very day that you're talking about it, the last generation, the consoles that precede the ones you play today, and then whatever the next generation might look like at any given time you bring up the idea of a next generation. To me, that's how I now look at and describe and talk about my video game generations. You know, I grew up in the glory days of the 8, 16, 32-bit generation, right? Like I said and have talked about many times. So I feel like I have a really good grasp on what it meant for a generation to exist where the consoles are releasing basically at around the same time. You can track the beginning and ends and starts of generations going back to those 80s and 90s eras. And it was a lot of fun. And it made things, like I said, very clean and simple. And it was easy to define. Nowadays, it's not a bad thing, but I think things are a little bit more convoluted. And yeah, Nintendo was the one that broke that mold. I don't even blame them. To me, the worst part about that is the simple fact that it only happened because the gamers didn't embrace the Wii U like I think they should have. Because it's a great console with a killer exclusive library and a really fun, unique controller that I think was great, and I wish that we embraced that concept more. I literally talked about that in just my last video, right? And so the only negative to me of this whole concept is just that, the Wii U failing from a sales perspective. But Nintendo moved on to a fantastic console. Their most successful home console, one of the most successful pieces of video game hardware in history. They clearly did nothing wrong, and they only did everything right. All that we can take away from it is that identifying and labeling generations as a 9th generation or a 10th generation or whatever label we wanted to give it, it's done. We don't really need to call them as generations anymore. I think we're just talking about last gen, current gen, next gen. To me, those are the 3 labels I apply to video game generations nowadays and will be going forward. And again, to reiterate the final point, I don't think there's any value to calling the Switch the 10th generation, the start of the 10th generation. I feel like that's a way to try to make it sound like the Switch 2 will be like, what's the word I'm trying to say? Not a bigger deal than it is, because it is going to be a huge deal, but it's trying to make it sound like something it isn't, basically. Hopefully you guys know what I mean when I say that. I mean, I just don't think the Switch 2 is going to be the 10th generation of video games. It's just going to be Nintendo's new generation. That's what it's going to be. And that's amazing. That's actually all it needs to be. It's going to be hugely successful. It's going to be a great console, I'm sure. The quality of the machine itself and the library we know is going to be great. I think Nintendo is in a new era that will last for a long, long time because of the Switch's success. Their decision to break the generational mold when they release the Switch, I think, is going to set them up for decades of future success, and that's great. And so at this point, kind of rambling here at the end, as I tend to do when I wrap up my videos. Really, all of my videos, I'm rambling the whole time, let's be honest. But I hope that this idea made sense to you guys, and I'll be really curious to learn and hear if you guys agree with my idea, if you disagree, which I'm sure a lot of people will disagree and tell me whatever you guys are going to say, because people in comments are weird. Comment sections on YouTube, man, they're a strange place. There are some strange people bopping about in comment sections on YouTube, man. But either way, I will still be curious to hear if you guys understand and agree with what I'm saying, or if you feel differently. Or maybe you just feel it's unimportant and you sat here for 20 minutes listening to me blab about this when you don't even find it a worthwhile concept, which, why would you do that? So this is how I feel. I miss the days of clean, obvious, clearly defined generations, but we don't live in that world anymore. It is not a bad thing. No one did anything wrong. It's just the way I see things, matter-of-factly. And so, yeah, I'll be excited for the Switch 2, which won't be the 10th generation of video game consoles, in my opinion.